town like merging with the one next door.
Yeah.
Like becoming this mega city. It's a question that like tons of communities are dealing with. And today, we're going to dive into whether bigger really is better when it comes to local government. We've got a whole bunch of research to unpack, academic studies, a look at what Australia learned about mergers, and even a deep dive into what happened when Toronto, decided to go big. Get ready for some aha moments as we explore all the ins and outs of merging municipalities. So first things first, why even think about merging towns? What's the supposed upside?
It kind of all comes down to this idea. It's super common in government, bigger equals better. They think that if you merge a bunch of municipalities, you'll like magically find all these cost savings and be way more efficient.
Okay, so it's like buying in bulk, but for like cities. Is that a whole economies of scale thing I keep seeing?
Yeah, exactly. Bigger cities can negotiate better deals on everything. I mean, from like road maintenance to fire trucks. Like, it's like when you buy that giant tub of mayo at Costco,
Yeah.
cheaper per ounce.
Right, but instead of mayo, it's streetlights and park benches and stuff.
Exactly.
And then there's that whole getting rid of duplication thing. Why have two garbage routes when one could cover, the same area?
Exactly. Streamlining bureaucracy, less waste. It sounds great, at least in theory. And some of the examples in these reports are like really interesting. One study talked about how merging local governments in Australia let them share a single building inspector, which saved everyone a bunch of money.
Wow. Shared resources, everyone working together, makes you wonder why every town isn't trying to become a mega city. But then, if it were that simple, wouldn't we see way more mega cities? What's the catch?
That's a key point. It sounds good, that whole economies of scale thing, but it doesn't always, work out that way. Like, we often run into this thing called diminishing returns.
Diminishing returns. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one.
Okay, so think of it this way. At what point does size become a burden instead of an advantage, right? Like, look at that example from Australia that we were just talking about. They thought they could cut costs by 20% when they merged all those local governments.
Wow, 20% is huge. Did it work?
Well, not really. They only ended up saving about 8.5%. And this is where things get, really interesting. Merging a bunch of different local governments is a lot more complicated than just redrawing some lines on a map. You've got all these different systems, cultures, different ways of providing services. Blending all of that isn't easy.
So you can't just say, like, okay, everyone, you're one big happy city now. So what happened in Australia? Why didn't they save as much money as they'd planned?
Well, one thing is mergers usually mean people losing their jobs, things getting moved around, and everyone having to, learn new ways of doing things. It's disruptive, and that always comes with costs, both financially and, morale takes a hit.
It's like when your favorite little bookstore closes down.
Yeah.
Some big chain bought them out. Maybe the books are a little cheaper, but
Yeah.
you lost something special. And it just doesn't feel the same anymore.
Exactly. And that whole sense of community, that local touch, that's super important when we're talking about local government. It's not just about like cold, hard efficiency. It's about responsiveness, knowing that people are listening and making sure that the needs of that specific community are actually being met. Have you ever felt like, just a number when you're dealing with some huge company?
Ugh, don't even get me started on my health insurance company. Okay, so what you're saying is that bigger isn't always better when it comes to local government, that there are good reasons to keep things local.
Exactly. One of the big problems is what they call the community of interest problem. When you combine towns that have totally different identities, different people, different histories, there's a real risk that you're going to lose some of those voices along the way.
Right, because you could have one town that's like mostly families, another one that's all retired people, and then another one that's got this like booming tech industry or something. And they all want different things from their local government.
Right. And it's tough for a huge city council to balance all those different competing needs, as well as smaller, more focused councils can. And then there's the whole responsiveness thing. Can some giant bureaucracy really understand what's going on in every little neighborhood the way a local council could?
It's like trying to have a conversation at like a family reunion with 1,000 people there. Good luck getting anyone to hear you.
Huh. That's a great way to put it. It makes you think about that other argument against merging, that whole accountability and engagement thing, too. Isn't it easier to hold your council member accountable when you see them at the grocery store or, like, at your kid's school play?
I could see that.
Yeah.
There's something to be said for that small town feeling, where you feel like
Yeah.
you really know what's going on, like your voice actually matters, and that you can like actually hold people accountable. We were looking at this really interesting example from Balmain, Australia, where they fought to break away from a bigger council so they could form their own independent one. What was the deal there?
It was pretty straightforward, actually. They felt like the bigger council wasn't paying attention to their needs. They were paying all these taxes, but it wasn't doing them any good. They wanted to be in control of their own, destiny, to have a say in how their money was being spent.
So they took things into their own hands. It's kind of like that whole voting with your feet thing you see in bigger cities, you know?
Yeah.
Like if you don't like the way things are, you just move.
Right. You choose to live in a place that shares your values, a place that's a good fit for you. And if your local government isn't doing that, you might decide to move if you can, obviously.
So it's about more than just like the budget and stuff. It's about who you are, who speaks for you, and having a say in your community. All of these arguments against merging make you really think twice about that whole bigger is better idea, don't they?
Absolutely. But let's look at what happened in Toronto, because that's a place that went all in on mergers.
Toronto, the merger capital of the world. Tell us more about that. What can we learn from them?
Toronto's interesting because they've gone through like multiple mergers over the decades, and each one has had its own goals and outcomes. It shows that it's not just about how big you are, it's about the circumstances, how it's done, and really getting what the communities themselves are all about.
Okay, so break it down for us. What made Toronto want to merge in the first place?
Well, right after World War II, they had this huge population boom, and the city just couldn't keep up. They needed more services, more infrastructure, everything. They needed a way to coordinate planning and development across the whole region. So in 1953, they created Metropolitan Toronto, which had a central metropolitan government, but then they also had 13 smaller municipalities too.
So that's a lot like that first wave of mergers in Australia that we talked about. It was all about dealing with rapid growth and figuring out how to make things work on a larger scale.
Yeah, exactly. Then over the next few decades, the whole Toronto region just kept growing outward, which led to even more mergers. That's how we got the Greater Toronto Area that exists today. But the biggest and most controversial merger was in 1998.
The mega merger of 98, wasn't that supposed to like solve all of Toronto's problems?
That was the idea, at least. The provincial government said that if they combined the 6 municipalities that were left into one mega city, they would save tons of money, streamline services, and make Toronto more competitive. It was a big gamble for sure.
So did it work? Did they get what they wanted? Did Toronto become this like super efficient machine?
Yeah.
So did it work? Did Toronto become this like super efficient machine?
Well, it's like most things in government, it's complicated. I mean, there were some wins early on, like Toronto was able to deal with some regional stuff better, and it turns out that bringing 6 different local governments, complex systems together is way harder and way more expensive than, they thought it would be. Costs didn't just magically disappear.
Why not? You'd think with less duplication and everything.
You'd think so, but they had to make salaries and benefits the same across all these different departments, and that costs money. And people didn't need fewer services just because the city got bigger, right? They still needed about the same number of workers to keep things running.
So no magical economies of scale, I guess. Didn't some people also feel like, I don't know, their voices weren't being heard anymore?
Yeah, that's a really important point, especially folks who lived in the, former suburbs. They felt kind of lost in this like giant mega city council. They missed that connection they used to have with their local councilors and felt like nobody was really listening to them anymore.
Which goes back to that community of interest problem we talked about, right? Even if a mega city looks good on paper, does it actually work for all the different people and neighborhoods? It doesn't sound like anyone's really sure about that yet.
Exactly. What Toronto shows us is that just being bigger doesn't mean better. Even if you have the best intentions, mergers can have surprise downsides. It's a good reminder that you need careful planning, gotta get the community involved, and you gotta be realistic about what you can actually achieve.
Okay, so just to recap, we've talked about the good stuff that's supposed to happen when you merge local governments, like being more efficient and saving money. We've looked at the arguments against merging, like losing that local control, what happens to accountability, and making sure that every neighborhood still gets what it needs. And we've taken a trip to Toronto to see how all of this plays out in the real world. So after this, deep dive into mergers, what's the bottom line? What should our listeners be taking away from all of this?
The big takeaway is that there's no right answer, no one solution that fits every situation. It's not about bigger is better or smaller is better. It all depends on the specifics. Every place is different with its own problems, its own opportunities. There's no magic formula.
So no easy answers, no guaranteed way to create like the perfect mega city.
Right. What works great in one place might be a total disaster somewhere else. Merging successfully depends on so many things: why you're doing it, what communities are involved, how well you plan it, even the overall political climate.
It's like that saying, it's not the size of the ship, it's the motion of the ocean. Or I guess in this case, it's not about the size of the city. It's about how they do it, what people need, and having a good plan for the future.
Absolutely. That's why you can't just assume bigger is always better. We need to be, critical thinkers, weigh the good and the bad, and most importantly, really talk to the people who are going to be impacted the most.
So have those tough conversations, ask questions, and don't assume that merging is the answer to everything, right?
This has been a really interesting deep dive. It definitely got me thinking. But it also feels like we're raising more questions too, if we shouldn't always be trying to merge, then what are the other options? What else can we do?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, I think we need to be talking about that a lot more.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of really innovative alternatives to just merging everything. Things like, regional partnerships where different towns work together, sharing services, even virtual collaborations. Those can accomplish a lot of the same goals without all the upheaval of merging.
So instead of one big super city, you have a bunch of towns that team up and share resources, share what they know, maybe even get a discount on streetlights together. Exactly. Imagine towns sharing equipment or negotiating better deals with suppliers together, or streamlining stuff like building codes and permits. That way, they can keep their own identity and control, but still get some of the benefits of working together.
It's like a potluck, but for local government. Okay, but we should probably wrap things up here. What's the one thing you want our listeners to remember from all of this?
Take a good look at your own local government. What's working well? What could be better? Could working with neighboring communities help? And most importantly, does everyone feel heard, like they have a voice?
Think critically, ask questions, and don't be afraid to shake things up a little bit. This has been an awesome deep dive, eye-opening, but isn't that what it's all about?
It is. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep pushing for the kind of local government that really works for your community.
And hey, if you do find yourself facing a merger, at least you'll be ready. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.